Elden Ring's particular brand of 2v1 and 3v1 invasions have a lot of extremely frustrating points, especially for the invader. Chief among them is the much maligned lack of friendly fire. You might be the best player in the world, but nothing can save you when you're caught in a 1-2 combo where the first hit staggers, proccing every status condition in the game, and the second procs a second instance of every status condition in the game. It's an easy way to die, and it ups the ante on what would otherwise be a survivable mistake. Now, friendly fire wouldn't exactly solve the absurd levels of damage in Elden Ring, but it could make cooperators think twice before recklessly swinging through each other to gank you into oblivion. And it's not like friendly fire is unheard of for a Souls game. It already exists in Elden Ring, but only on the side of invaders. Why FromSoft chose to burden invaders and not hosts is at the very heart of our question. It could be a lore implication. Dark Souls 3 pitched different factions as allied or hostile based around covenants, and while Elden Ring has abandoned covenants entirely, the red-on-red violence could speak to the implicit bloodlust and the consequences of blind aggression. There is also the mechanical aspect of presuming an invader needs to be disadvantaged at every turn. Normally, an invader would be out-healed, outnumbered, and out-leveled. If the odds are slightly more even at 2v2, friendly fire helps to ensure hosts have a generous tilt in their favor. But is that really fair? Would it be so game-breaking to ask hosts to consider the positioning of their allies before spamming L2 explosions till their FP runs dry? Well, if Elden Ring has taught us nothing else, it's that hosts are seldom willing to surrender an advantage, and invasions are not supposed to be fair. Still, positioning, spacing, and situational awareness are valuable traits through all aspects of gameplay, PvE and PvP alike. It doesn't sound unreasonable to ask a little more from players in a series lauded for its trial-by-fire learning curve, though it could be said Elden Ring has abandoned much of that approach in favor of a more lenient, freeform design. And we must not forget Elden Ring has leaned heavily into a category of broad, high-damage attacks that would pose considerable risk to one's allies. If a player's strategy is to be an explosion mage, they're as much a liability to their allies as they are an enemy. But that's obviously the point. Just as players need to manage their windows for healing, they have to manage their windows for damage. Friendly fire would just make damage windows smaller. And that actually could be a major deciding factor as to why FromSoft left it out. Elden Ring is the biggest Souls game, especially when it comes to average attack radius. If you need to not only wait for a small opening between every enemy's seemingly endless combos, but also check to make sure none of your allies have wandered down range, it could easily shatter how Elden Ring handles encounter design. This is to say nothing of latency and the less-than-ideal camera control, both of which frustrate plenty without friendly fire getting into the mix. And we can hopefully agree that the main incentive for friendly fire would be to stop spam against invaders. Sure, ganking bosses can really undercut the difficulty, but that's hardly an issue for anyone other than those people who might be ruining their own fun. Invaders, on the other hand, don't always deserve that boss-level ganking. They're part of a multiplayer experience, just like everyone else, and they want to play their role. The problem comes in when the game is immensely exploitable, something Souls games have always facilitated to one extent or another. When there are Ashes of War that easily trap a player and all but guarantee death, that becomes a default strategy. After all, why be creative if it gets in the way of a win? So the impulse for invaders, myself included, to wish that AoE and projectile spam couldn't be spammed without consequence is perfectly reasonable. But broad, always-on friendly fire might not be the way to go about it. For one thing, think of the griefing potential and the harm it could do to cooperation. A new player is stuck on some encounter, so they summon a cooperator for assistance. If that cooperator had a mind to do so, they could just immediately turn on the host. They tried this with Mad Phantoms in Dark Souls 3, and, at least in my experience, they exclusively try to kill you. If this were applied to all Cooperators, it would turn every summon into an invader. Invaders would just send their summon sign to all pools and wait for their victims to summon their own demise, and hosts would avoid them like the plague. As much as the metrics and optics may have shifted over the years, we can't forget this is supposed to be jolly cooperation. Such vile behavior would be unbecoming of a warrior of sunlight. If the game does not enforce its logic, many players will simply devolve to the lowest common denominator. So if we can't just have friendly fire, what could be done? Well, I see a few options. Non-damaging staggers are something that have worked well for Monster Hunter, basically allowing Cooperators to bump into each other and disrupt movements and actions. But again, there's griefing potential there. Not that every single Cooperator wants to be a jerk and body block their host, but when the potential is there, the issue will arise. For example, I am occasionally summoned as a blue, but given my proclivity for invasion, I frequently sit out the fight or do whatever I can to help a fellow red. It's not in the spirit of being a hunter, yet my empathy dictates my actions. And frankly, I'm against anything that would further disincentivize multiplayer. The second a Cooperator baseline represents anything other than a clear and motivated ally, engagement will suffer. Instead, I'd be more interested in exploring mechanical options that give invaders more environmental control. Obviously, I want a 6-player limit. Actually, I want an 8-player or 10-player limit. Maybe even more. I don't know. I want more fucking players. 3v1 is boring as a host, depressing as a Cooperator, shameful as a blue, and oppressive as an invader. But more players won't necessarily fix spam. More players can just mean more spam. What we need is a way for invaders to adjust their advantage and catch Cooperators off guard. Picture this. An invader arrives, attacks, and is repelled by the cooperative wall of 3 at-the-ready players. As the invader retreats, relegating themselves to harassing strategies and hit-and-run tactics, their chance at victory is slim. The host team is fortified in their position and have no reason to move or make themselves vulnerable. They can wait forever. Suddenly, a red mist sets in over their encampment. A meter builds on the screens of the summons, and once filled, bloodlust sets in. The summons are now blood red, allied with their former foe against their own host. They are forced to decide if they want to lean into their new way of life or try their best to aid the host with a notable disadvantage. If they attack the host, it may be just desserts. If they fight the invader, at least it's not without risk. No matter what, they can't fight enemies. They're essentially helpless against everyone except the other players. Now, this is not a perfect mechanic by any measure, but it is in line with what I'd like to see. Some way for the invader to affect a host's world that offers a change-up to a 3v1. If they went far enough to disable friendly fire faction-wide and made it impossible for Reds to hit each other, it would cement the mechanic as something no host could ignore. I love the idea that the mere presence of an invader can infect the world with something like bloodlust, altering Cooperators along with who knows what else. It's essentially in line with what Gravelording tried to accomplish way back in the first Dark Souls by creating phantoms in a host's world until they find the Gravelord and defeat them. But I get that a lot of Cooperators could be extremely adverse to this sort of shift. People don't usually want to fight their friends, game mechanics be damned. So I figure it'd have to be a mechanic that sets in over time, like the fog of a battle royale, slowly creeping in to force interaction. And once all invaders are defeated, the mist fades. Alternatively, it could be something invaders can use, like the Phantom Bloody Fingers, where they can apply it to an area with limited uses, requiring thoughtful deployment. Elden Ring could do with all manner of world alterations instead of the most bland and one-note multiplayer. It's committed to spam mechanics in a way that has narrowed the scope of battle to these default outcomes, and barring fixing that, an easy solution would be allowing invaders to actually affect the world around them. Imagine if invaders could manipulate enemy mobs, making them more aggressive or leading them to hosts. There are so many interesting dynamics to play with, all of which could have a hugely positive impact on the invasion experience for everyone involved. Hosting wouldn't be so boring, cooperating wouldn't be so depressing, hunting wouldn't be so shameful, and invading wouldn't be so oppressive. Let me know what you think of friendly fire and invader influence in the comments. I know a lot of folks explicitly hate invasions and would sooner see the mechanic removed than adjusted, but that's boring and not something I consider a serious opinion. There are painfully few games that allow for this sort of interaction, and it deserves to be further explored, not shelved for the sake of those who can't be bothered to try something new. Like the video if you liked it and subscribe for more. Until next time, thank you for watching.